IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya and I'm joined by Manoj, and we want to talk about journalism today, and really specifically journalism between India and China. India and China are in the process of expelling each other's journalists from their countries. The very last Indian journalist, a person from Press Trust of India, is also scheduled to leave China when his visa expires, I think later this month. And soon we'll have no Indian journalists in China. What does this mean? Does it matter? If it matters, why does it matter? And how did we come to this? And finally, perhaps, is there a way out? I'm joined, of course, by the China dude, Manoj. Welcome, Manoj.
Thanks, Aditya. Good to be here.
Hey, you've been a journalist yourself, and you're the China dude. So you're the best person to talk about this. What do you make of this role? And I mean, how did we come to this?
Yeah, I think how did we come to this is quite straightforward, right? I think there is a straight line that we can draw from the Galwan Valley to this decision. I think that it's one other sort of notch in what has been a difficult 3 years for the relationship between India and China, and it's also a sign that tensions that may take place in the military domain will spill over into all different aspects of the relationship. I think that often people ask the question when the External Affairs Minister of India, S. J. Shankar, says things like, how can I expect the relationship to be normal when you've got these tensions on the boundary? And often journalists tend to ask him that, well, if your trade is going so high, then how is it not normal? And you're dealing with China at the G20 or at the SCO or at BRICS, then what is not normal about the relationship? I think this is one example of what is not normal about the relationship, that there is such a breakdown of trust. And that breakdown of trust, which has fundamentally taken place in the military domain and had an implication in the political domain, is spilling over into all other areas. People to people ties have generally been free of some of these stresses. But now we're seeing even that take place, right? We're seeing this decision on journalists from both sides. That's the context in which I would see it. What's interesting to me about this incident is that it's Beijing saying that it is reciprocating what India is doing. So it sees India as the entity which has India as the Indian government as the government which has precipitated events. And that's no surprise to me, because it is India which has wanted to shift what is a militarily difficult situation, and a situation in which it has suffered a setback in Eastern Ladakh, to try and pressurize China through other means, including, say, we saw the ban on apps, we've seen some action on economic issues, closer cooperation with the United States, and now this. So that's the context, I think, of why we've gotten here.
Yeah, so then that sounds very different from, say, when China expelled these 3 Wall Street Journal reporters in 2020 after, an opinion piece in the journal. So this seems to be entirely different. It's India really, taking this dispute and using all the tools it has available to it, to respond to Beijing. But why respond with journalists? Why not with trade or something else? So how does it really help when both sides can just expel each other's reporters, right?
Yeah, look, I can only speculate as to why the Indian government might have done this. This is not the first time that we've seen in the last few years some degree of friction with regard to journalists. I think in 2017 or 2018, I might be getting my years wrong, there was a case where there were 3 Xinhua journalists who were in India who were sent back. Again, similar action was taken where their visas were not renewed, and they were not permitted to be in India. Nothing was officially said by the Indian government, but source-based reporting in the Indian media had said that these journalists had engaged in, for the lack of a better phrase, extracurricular activities, not activities beyond their brief as journalists. And I don't know, you can make what of anything of that. All these Chinese journalists in India are essentially state media journalists. So they are essentially agents of the state, although the Indian government doesn't recognize them as agents of the state, unlike, say, the United States. So they were sent back, and the Indian government, again through source-based reporting at that point in time, had sort of let out information that it's not like we are asking them to reduce their staff in India or blocking their activities, but these three people need to go back, and you can send replacements. So we are not asking you to downsize. This time around, clearly, at least the Indian government has not said much on any of this stuff, but from the news that's come out from the Chinese side, tells us that there used to be about 14 journalists, Chinese state media journalists in India in 2020, and that number has gone down to now one, and that last journalist is also expected to leave soon. So why shift it to journalism? I think it's perhaps a way of sending a message to what is seen as state actors, and sending a message that look, the relationship is not normal, and as long as this abnormal state continues, there will be different areas of the relationship where we will continue to see pressure. From an Indian point of view, it's a low cost move to send back Chinese journalists, and often if you see reporting about India in the Chinese press, there's nothing necessarily terribly objective about it. It's I can't say that it's not factual. Often it is factual, but it's essentially news about things going bad, things going wrong, accidents, misgovernance, corruption, social strife, civil strife, which is, as a journalist, I think, yeah, news tends to be usually bad news. But, when you compare that to, say, reporting about China in the Chinese press, where often, particularly in the state media press, you'll not see terribly negative reporting. So it's this reporting on India fits a pattern of Chinese reporting when it comes to other countries, particularly democracies, as fundamentally chaotic, misgoverned, poorly run, with lots of infrastructural problems, and lots of corruption. And that's usually used to juxtapose against China's orderly governance. During the pandemic, there was a phrase that became very popular in Chinese media, in Chinese official narrative, which was, you compare the governance of China versus the chaos of the West. And I think the chaos also is something that India is usually depicted as something, as a country which is in constant chaos. So you don't necessarily see, say, from a narrative point of view for the Indian government, that there is a loss in that sense, right? You see that actors who are anyway not interested in reporting positively about the Indian government, or generally about India, have been expelled, whereas you know the four Indian journalists who are in China are now also coming back, and to that degree there is a cost. And I don't think the Indian government is terribly bothered about that cost. Society is a different matter, but I don't think the government is bothered. So therefore, from a government's point of view, I don't think it was necessarily a high cost move, but it was a move that sent a message directly to state media functionaries.
So I completely take your point, Manoj, that a journalist from China is not the same as a journalist from country with a free press. Clearly not, and it doesn't require much of a stretch of imagination to imagine, that some of these people may be engaged in extracurricular activities, and also, there is obviously a clear agenda in what they report, and while you could always claim that newsrooms have biases and different priorities. This is different. It's entirely different. It's trying to drive a narrative that comes from the Chinese state itself. So I take your point that this is really perhaps no big loss for India in terms of Chinese reporting on India. But what about Indians reporting in China? Don't they lose out? And don't, as a result, Indian audiences lose out on some relatively more free reporting?
Yeah, look, before we sort of get to that question, I think I agree with the idea, like I said, that the agenda is different and all that is different. Despite that, I would, given the kind of journalistic environment that I would want in India, I would want even these reporters to be welcome in India, regardless of their agenda. We understand their agenda and all of that, but reporters from any country, I would be okay with that. They should be welcome and be able to operate freely, because that's the Indian, that's our democracy, how open we are. And so to me, that's fine. We can think, given their other activities that they may be engaged in, it might be worth considering whether, if you are a state funded agency, should there be different rules for you? Perhaps, but they should be welcome. We shouldn't be constraining, we shouldn't be blocking off access, right? And that's the same thing from a Chinese point of view. I think when you block off access for Indian journalists to operate in China, the net loss is to the Indian public, the Indian readership, and the Indian audiences, and to the Chinese themselves. So for the loss to the Indian audiences is quite clear, right? In the just let's go back 6-8 months, right? Before the 20th Party Congress in October last year, In September, there was a big news story in India and on social media. So it came from social media about this big line of trucks, armored trucks moving towards Beijing. And apparently, a coup was underway to
Right.
overthrow Xi Jinping. And this had become massive news, right? I mean, mainstream Indian news channels were carrying the story. And there was, I think, a Danish journalist who lives in Beijing who had done a funny little Twitter thread talking about how, I'm at Tiananmen Square, everything seems fine here, no coup here. And he kept walking around the city saying, no coup here. But Indian media still covered it. And they covered it as though there was actually something happening. And their argument was that, well, it's worth questioning. How can there be smoke without fire and all of that stuff? Whereas the fact was that the Indian journalists who were living in Beijing were telling us there is nothing like this happening. You guys need to get over yourself. I think that incident, that example, tells you a little bit about how, for our understanding of China. Also, it's important because Indian journalists can often, even Indian academia and Indian sort of, academia may be good in thinking through serious things, but academia can be extremely poor in communicating to the wider public. And journalists do that job really, really well, right? They're able to capture the public mood much easier than, say, academics can, right? So, in all that sense, yes, I think it's a loss for the Indian audiences in terms of their ability to understand what's happening in China, the ability to understand what's happening in China independently, because often now we are likely to rely much more on official sources because you don't have independence reporters from India, particularly, who are trying to understand what's going on in the country. Yes, you have reporters from the West and other international publications, which is great, but the stories that they may be interested in, the issues that may capture their attention, or the issues that may capture the attention of Europeans or Americans or the Japanese or the South Koreans, are very different from the issues that may capture our attention. So it's important to therefore have Indians also there who can bring the story to us. I also said that it's a loss for Beijing, and this has been my sort of why I think that while the Chinese side has basically said what we are doing is reciprocating and we didn't want to precipitate this. I can see why they didn't want to precipitate it. Because if you think of it, one of Beijing's biggest misinformation and disinformation, and because of the lack of understanding of how the Chinese system operates, and because of the opacity of the system, can be so easily sort of spread in a willing ecosystem, which is the Indian market. And that makes it extremely important for Indians to have access to China, Indian journalists to be there, and Indian media to be reporting much more factually on what's happening in China. So to me, that's a clear loss. Challenges with regard to other countries, particularly India, is this issue of, everybody seems to have a Western prism to look at China. And that's been their grouse, right? Countries need to look at us independently, have an independent view. Every time our ministers meet, the Chinese side tends to repeat this, right? You must have an independent view. Even to the Europeans, they now say you
Yeah.
must have an independent view. Yet, if you're going to block access for independent Indian voices to operate within China, then how on earth is the Indian system or the Indian audiences or the Indian government to develop an independent view? And Beijing may not think that it matters because governments have their channels of information and will still remain informed and will still remain connected. But what it doesn't seem to understand is that in democracies, it matters what citizens think, because that enables governments to do the kinds of things that they may want to do, which may be unpopular at a certain point of time, but public opinion can facilitate some of that action. So I think that it's a foolhardy move from Beijing's point of view, particularly if its stated interest is for us to develop our independent view of China.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Even if it's just something as simple as if Indian journalists, if say that you have a border clash, even if it's just asking the right question during a Ministry of Foreign Affairs press conference, that's something that foreign reporters may not be interested in doing. And that's why it's so useful to have an Indian reporter actually for both countries to help shape the perception and to help get the right messages out there. Connected to what you're saying, Manoj, could you speak a bit about how China seeks to mold perceptions of India within China? I mean, you've touched upon it a bit, democracies are a mess. Is there something specific about India in the coverage of India? And also, does China seek to, what's the image that China seeks to project to India of its own self?
Okay, let's take the first question first, which is how is India usually covered in Chinese media? I mean, when I was in China and I was looking at working within Chinese media, one of the things that I saw was that often you had those sort of, I mean, India was not necessarily seen from a threat perception, at least in the media. It was seen as an actor that could have been a major player but has missed the boat on many occasions. Is fundamentally, the politics is very messy, which doesn't allow India to really rise to the potential that it might have, and its society is too deeply fractured for that rise to happen. And so it was generally seen as an opportunity or a great power in the making that has often and always missed the boat. That was the Chinese narrative on India and sort of a junior power in Asia. That I think has given way. So starting from 2017 onwards, Doklam onwards. I mean, during the Doklam standoff, you saw a lot of anger in the Chinese press, which was very uncharacteristic in terms of their coverage of India in the past. I mean, one of the narratives about India that has always remained, and I mean, you can go back to the 1940s and 50s, the idea of Nehru being the so-called running dog of the Western imperialists and so on and so forth. That narrative today has sort of a different motif, right? It comes in the form of, India being a partner for the US in containing China, right? And through the Quad and other things. So that has always existed, but yet India was seen as a power which couldn't necessarily do too much, at least in the press. That's changed since 2017. After Doklam, the Chinese media was very aggressive during that 70 odd days standoff. The People's Daily republished its editorial of 1962, threatening war, threatening to teach India a lesson, and so on and so forth. And since then, we've seen a deterioration in terms of how India is covered, even more so. After the Galwan Valley clash, you saw, Chinese soldiers, the 4 soldiers who died, publicly talked about soldiers being awarded posthumously, and one of the soldiers who's alive was, given the July 1st medal. The story of the soldier who was involved in the Galwan Valley clash who died has been part of school curriculum. So this change, in the story of the guy as part of school curriculum, essentially talk about bravery and those sorts of things, right? Positive values. But the idea that you're using conflict with India as part of, molding social attitudes, it may not be the most prominent thing, but the fact that it figures in this dialogue, whereas it did not after 1962, tells us a little bit about the shift in how China perceives India. And the media also, therefore, often covers India within this context, right? Across the Chinese analytical and academic community, what you will see is that there are different views. One view is that India is essentially quasi part of the Western system to contain China. Another view is that while India may be sort of some part of maybe cozying up to America, is doing this in an opportunistic manner. It recognizes the fact that it wants to maintain strategic autonomy because it has these great power ambitions. Unless, of course, the Chinese president does something. So I'll give you another example. Recently, we had the train crash in Orissa, the horrific train crash. Ordinarily, it won't have made any sort of headlines in Chinese media. Uh, but it was on the front page of the People's Daily because the Chinese president sent a letter of condolence to the Indian side, and therefore it was covered on the front page. So that's how usually we see coverage of India in the Chinese press. In terms of what image China wants to project to India, I think it fundamentally wants to project. Again, there are two or three contradictory images. One of those is that China is already a great power, and therefore India must know its rightful place and appreciate China's greatness and recognize that it can't compete really. So therefore, respect China's core interests to begin with. The other sort of narrative is that while China is a great power, India is also a great civilization, and they are both civilizational powers, and we can coexist with each other. We just need to find the right format of cooperation. So, the idea that we must both see each other as opportunities as not as threats. That's another side of the narrative. And the third side of the narrative that I think Chinese media tends to focus on, and even Chinese political actors when it comes to India, is around the fact that essentially it's the West which is animating challenges between us. The West and certain agents of the West, they may not be direct agents, but essentially capitalist-minded people who believe in ideas of hegemony and therefore desire Indian hegemony in the Indian Ocean region. And those are the kind of ideas that we must push back against. So you'll see these mix of these narratives in play. In terms of the image of China, the idea is this: that look at us as an opportunity and not as a threat, while recognizing the fact that we've surpassed you as a major power, and this gap that we've built up is unlikely to be bridged. So, as let me quote The Rock. I used to grow up watching wrestling. and he used to say, "Shut your mouth and know your role." And I think that's what the Chinese are essentially one of the big narratives with regard to India is this, right? Know your role know your place in the pecking order.
Wow. And Manoj, you also worked at CGTN, for some 3 or more years. Is this what you experienced then as well? I mean, is the sense of we are not a threat, you can deal with us, but know your place?
And at the same time, so it can't necessarily entirely be trusted by the West also, and this gives China some openings. And then you've got a third side of the narrative, which is that, hey, look, at the end of the day we are both Asian powers, and there will be potentially an Asian century, and India needs to get its act together for that Asian century to take place, and so on and so forth. So you'll find these narratives in the academic community which reflect in the media, but generally media coverage of India tends to remain negative, tends to be de-emphasized. It's not your sort of focal area. So you'll rarely ever see some big news. Yeah, I think this was commonplace, right? I mean, there was a mix of this. Right? There was a mix of you could have been something, but you missed the boat, and we far surpassed you. And you are you're a minor power, and you will remain a minor power. At the same time, this coexists with the fact that, hey, but we are both Asians and we can work together, and that's our common bond. And these nasty Westerners, they try to divide us. Why don't we work in a common manner? So these two things coexisted. That disdain which came with know your role coexisted with this idea that, hey, but we have this great history together, and Asian power and this imagined sense of Asian solidarity, and we can work together. So they tended to coexist in the media narrative. In terms of public perception in China, I don't think this was the case. I think people have always been very, I mean, at least in my experience in China, people have always been extremely welcoming, extremely nice, extremely warm, deep sense of appreciation for India, from Buddhism to Bollywood. So I don't think that at a public level, at least in my time in China, this was something that was deeply felt. Or this sort of angst with regard to Indians. I think Indians are generally welcomed and treated very nicely, and all of that. But in terms of the elite narrative when it comes to sort of politics and geopolitics, this was the ideal narrative. And I think this, I don't know how much this has percolated at the public level. I don't think it's still a deep sort of sense that, which has built public animosity. I don't think that exists. And you can see that in the difference in, say, how when Indian journalists were in China, and when they traveled to cover different events, as opposed to when Western journalists traveled, the kind of pushback that Western journalists were getting in the last few years. So, for example, when the floods happened in Changzhou some time back, you saw lots of locals hounding Western journalists, whether it was in the LA Times, whether it was in BBC, essentially calling them names, attacking them as being outsiders and all of that. Whereas you never saw that with regard to Indians or Indian journalists. So it's a strange contradiction that coexists.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure China is not the only country that has the strange and slightly schizophrenic idea of itself and of other countries, right? But yeah, that's really interesting. Manoj, do you see a way out of this? Does India have the motivation, and China, to restore some of these old privileges, if you will, of allowing each other's journalists to operate?
Look, I think if any of this is going to happen, it's going to happen quietly. It's not going to happen publicly in that sense. So very quietly, they'll try and do this. My sense is I'm a little perplexed as to why why the Chinese government chose to take the reciprocal step that it says it took. It would have been far smarter for them to have not done anything and to have let the Indian journalists operate in China. And if the issue came up in public, they would have said, look, we don't, we don't treat this as a problem, and we would appreciate the Indian side also respects Chinese journalists. My guess is that they were perhaps trying to do this for some time until when the rules changed in India for Chinese journalists. The issue became that they were getting only short-term visas, and it became problematic, and then it became an issue somewhere in the bureaucracy. The smart thing would have been for Beijing to have just let the Indian journalists be there, and to have constantly, whenever the Indian journalists talk to them, tell them that ask your government to reciprocate. I presume they have been doing this for some time, but that would have been smarter in my view, because like I said, I don't think it serves Beijing's interests to do this. So if this gets restored, I think it's going to happen, quietly, like just as the rules have changed quietly. The Indian government has not said much. I don't know whether it will say anything much at all. Likely it will not say anything. Now, 2024 elections happen in India. Until then, I don't see anything changing in this regard, unless we see some sort of shifts taking place in Eastern Ladakh, and the Indian government sort of steps back and says, okay, we want to sort of go step by step to restoring some of these things. And you might see a few more visas being issued and things like that. So, short answer, nothing in the short term, I think, is going to ease. Even if whenever things change, it'll likely happen very, very quietly than with both sides saying that, hey, we want to restore things. I mean, just to end on this point is that if you go back to the Mamlapuram informal summit between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, one of the big outcomes of this summit was, people to people ties. And we are going to improve people to people ties. And both countries need to understand each other and so on and so forth. And 4 years down, nearly 4 years down, we are at a point where we can't seem to even talk to each other bilaterally in any which way. And we can't even have journalists in each other's country. So, it just goes to show how badly the relationship has deteriorated. And this last bastion, which was non-controversial, people to people engagement, seems to also be hit. So I think we're in sort of for a tough time, particularly over the next year, even if disengagement is to take place in the remaining areas and whatever that disengagement and then subsequent de-escalation mean, it's going to be tough to get back to some degree of normalcy.
Well, on that note, Manoj, I don't expect normalcy to return anytime soon, but I think we'll just have to rely on you and our other colleagues to make sense of China for us until things improve.
Yeah, I was going to say this is a windfall for me, folks. You can sign up for my Tracking People's Daily newsletter. At least you get some analysis, which is original. Unfortunately, we don't have access to the country anymore.
Absolutely. Yes, I couldn't recommend that more. Yes, that's the perfect natural plug. Okay, yes, absolutely. Check out Manoj's newsletter. There's absolutely nothing like it. And if you really want to make sense of China on a daily basis, that's the best place to start. So on that note, Manoj, thanks.
Thanks so much, Aditya.
And thank you for joining us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.